Is Mythic Plus ready to move on from timers as we know it? That's going to be the key question that I ask you in today's thought exercise as we walk about, the current World of Warcraft design. Us, this gathering of amateurs and armchair devs, all of us with these differing opinions. You're more than free to answer that question and be on your way, but I would very, very much appreciate it if you were to stay until the end. I hope to have a navigation thing somewhere around here so you can jump around too. And this isn't the first time that I've brought this topic of Mythic Plus timers up. I'm not the first person to bring it up, and I'm not going to be the last. Today, though, we live in a slightly different World of Warcraft from, say, like a year ago, where where the gatekeeping of rewards is kind of being polished away, and players have more opportunities to obtain rewards and get into challenging activities. Mythic Plus is more accessible than it has ever been. The timer, especially at lower levels, it might be something to be easily ignored because you do well at this game. For others, the timer feels like an albatross. It's a strobe light. It's an unnecessary ball and chain that continues to turn some people off. And that's the target audience that we're going to be focused on. These folks who are interested in dungeons and running more difficult kinds of dungeons, but not so much with the added pressure that comes with these timers. And my intention is not to persuade you or to tell you that your current thinking is wrong, but to just kind of take a step back and challenge the current status quo. We're all WoW friends, I hope, right? So sit back and relax as I thank the sponsor of today's video, HelloFresh. Since the pandemic, I've been more dependent on delivery services and I want to try a healthier and cheaper option. HelloFresh sends pre-portioned ingredients and easy recipes right to your door. You just open the pack, you mix it up, and you cook it. It's so easy that even someone like me can follow it and have a quick and easy dinner set up. I tried out 3 dinner dishes and they turned out great, and now I want a panko air fry like everything. HelloFresh isn't just for dinner either. They offer snacks and easy lunches, recipes for seasonal celebrations, big gatherings, and quick meals you can throw together in 15 minutes or less. I was a skeptic at first, but after trying them out, HelloFresh is a great option for people who want to take the guesswork out of grocery shopping, save some money, and feel good preparing their own food. You can try them out by clicking the link below or by going to HelloFresh.com and use code POGHF112687 to get a special discount. Yeah, this helps out the channel, cool, but don't do it for me, do it for you. So I should talk about how I came to the conclusion that the timer as it is needs a revisit to see if it still has a place in every level of Mythic Plus. It's actually thanks to patch 10.15 and the Mega Dungeon, the Dawn of the Infinite, that led me here. The dungeon's tough, it's rewarding, and it has no timer, just like in any old dungeon in WoW from the past 20 or so years. Specifically, the Mega Dungeon gives 8 opportunities for gear and 45 total aspect fragments. If you translate this into Mythic Plus clears, that's like running a bunch of plus 16 keys, anywhere between 4 to 9 clears, depending on if you time them or not. Before the Mega Dungeon, the only way to get Aspect Crest was from either those plus 16 or higher dungeons or from Mythic level raids, and this new option happened to arrive 2 months after the season began, so it comes to little surprise that there wasn't a whole lot of grumbling from the more competitive side of players. There weren't really any complaints that the Mega Dungeon would be desired over keys. In fact, it was sort of the opposite. A segment of those players, they got their clears, maybe their hard mode clears, and then they went right back to their keys and their Mythic raids because of the scaling nature of it. At the moment, the Mega Dungeon is the toughest content for the kind of player who wants a challenge but can't get into a Mythic raid group and doesn't consider a timer to be the kind of gameplay challenge that feels great for them. And surely the WoW team realized that they created a kind of formula of accessibility here where, let's really break it down. The season starts, and then 2 months later, after the PvE races are over and the revival catalyst is in play, hey, here's a new dungeon to challenge us without needing a timer, and it awards at least a fraction of what you'd normally get from high-level Mythic Plus dungeons and or heroic raids. In a way, whether folks realize it or not, this mega dungeon opened the door to creating a divide between the less competitive and the more competitive player, with options to satisfy everyone's needs. Less competitive players, I know I'm describing this a lot, they might be seeking out greater challenges than Raid Finder or regular Mythics, but for their reasons, they don't feel comfortable with the time-sensitive nature of Mythic Plus, and the Mega Dungeon is the perfect answer for them. More competitive-minded players, they're totally fine with Mythic Plus as it is right now. Outside of the usual gripes of balancing, they mostly enjoy the system as it is. For now, we have this working test case that this sort of hybrid of systems works. But is it a one-off? Are people going to be okay in future seasons if a path to aspects and hero gear is not made available? Or can this formula be replicated or emulated? I think it can, and I'm going to provide two examples. One is going to be pretty easy to explain. The other is a big pain in the ass, and it's going to be full of holes for you to nitpick and go through, but I'm going to do my best to explain it. So let's start with the easy method. Pretend that we've started patch 10.2. It's season 3 of Dragonflight now. The Mega Dungeon, well, we've kind of been there, done that, but now the Mega Dungeon can be accessed through Heroic and Mythic Plus difficulty. We got new content with the Raid and Zone stuff and PvP stuff and whatever. Very cool. And we just enjoy whatever it is that we're getting. And then 2 months pass. A theoretical 10.2.5 becomes a thing, and with it come... these are really bad names, but here come Super Dungeons. 2 Super Dungeons. For the sake of illustration, it's Eye of Ashar from Legion and Mists of Tyrna Scythe from Shadowlands. And they're given this whole Mega Dungeon treatment with juiced up trash and mob and boss mechanics, and the gameplay loop is going to be pretty simple. You kill bosses, difficult bosses, and you get loot. And just like the Mega Dungeon or any other Mythic Dungeon, you get loot 1 time per week and you're loot locked until the reset. It's the same stuff. And this Super Dungeon thing is going to come in with every 0.5 patch going forward. So we'll get like 2 super dungeons in these patches, or maybe 1 if it happens to be like a ton of bosses, and it's thrown in the middle of the season to present this additional challenge and loot for the primary audience. Again, these folks who don't really run keys, and be a supplement for more competitive players to at least tap into every now and then for fun or for gearing up. Hopefully we'd see a pattern where in a given expansion, one of the 0.5 patches happens to be a mega dungeon and the other 0.5 patches are rounds of these super dungeons. My hope is that Dragonflight 10.1.5, it starts a pattern to be repeated. Now, overall, it means more content opportunities for everyone, additional challenge and good loot that doesn't directly compete with the likes of Mythic Plus because it comes later in the season. This does mean that the WoW team is going to have to consistently put in work at converting 1 or 2 super dungeons per season, but hey dude, if it gets more people playing, I think it's worth it. Alright, so that's the easy way. Now let's try the hard way, or the more complicated way that's going to disrupt Mythic Plus as we know it. I want to thank my Twitch chat for letting me bounce ideas off of them for like a couple of days and for them to offer their own. First big difference, we're going to remove the penalties that come from timers, from Mythic Keystone levels 2 all the way up to 16. The timers, of course, are still going to be there. They're not gone. And timing the key will still get you score for the purpose of obtaining achievements like Keystone Master or whatever, and for people to, unfairly judge you at a glance. But you no longer need to meet time to advance your key to the higher level. All you have to do is just beat the dungeon on that key, and then the key gets better. Now, there are some consequences to taking these penalties out, obviously. It means, one, that keys will no longer decay below a 16. Like, once you've dungeoned your way up to a 16, that very first time, you're always going to have a 16 key, at minimum, for the remainder of the entire season. In case you wanted to run a lower key of the dungeon that you're assigned, you no longer have to go to an NPC and, drop your key down. You're now able to, from the pedestal, just select the level of key that you want based on the highest key that you have access to, all the way up to a 16. And then you can re-roll your key to a different dungeon off of any clear that you've done. You just need to talk to that NPC at the very end. As usual, the key that was used is going to change on its own, and it's never going to decay. Advancing your key is going to be pretty simple, and here's an example. Let's say the season starts and you have a +2 key, all right? then you clear that 2, regardless of how long it took you, and then it jumps up to a 5. Clear that 5, and then it jumps up to an 8. Now let's say you have this 8 key and you're helping an undergeared friend and they're like, can we just run like a 7 because whatever? And you're like, okay, fine. So you and your buddy, you run a 7 with your key. Clear that, and then your key jumps up to a 10. So you're always going to advance 3 levels from the key that you just ran until it stops at 16, and I'll explain what happens there in a bit. So what do you get at the end of a dungeon? Because, I mean, so far it sure sounds like the best way to gear up is to claw your way up to 16s and then farm it like a crazy person. While the current Mega Dungeon gives item level 437 gear and aspect crests, this actually isn't consistent with how Mythic Plus works right now. Right now, if you complete a plus 16, you get item level 424 gear, that's champion gear, at the end of the dungeon, and you get 441 Mythic gear from the Great Vault. The whole gearing scheme for Mythic Plus is pretty intricate, and I'm not going to touch it. I get it because the current Mega Dungeon doesn't give you anything from the Great Vault. You just get, the 437 gear, and you get the aspect crests, but you don't get anything from the vault, but you have everything that you need to create your own 441s each week. Since we're not going with the separate Mega Dungeon mode and we're going with a revamp of Mythic Plus, this is what we've got. So at the end of a 16 dungeon, which you can now spam freely, you'll get rank 4 out of 8 champion class gear and some aspect crests, which is, it's only like okay for gearing up because it's only champion gear. With this current chart that's shown on screen, what you want to do is run 14s and 15s for the champion gear and the worm crest that are needed to max out that gear. But you want to make sure you run at least one 16 a week to get a piece of 441 gear from the vault, and then farm more 16s if you want to upgrade those pieces with aspect crests. Also, since you can't fail these keys, the amount of crest fragments that you earn per clear is going to need to be adjusted. Like right now, you get 5 for clearing and 12 for timing. Maybe what we can do is meet halfway at 8 crest fragments per clear, so you only need to clear 2 dungeons to make 1 complete crest. Of course, it's still going to be a Mythic Plus dungeon. There are still affixes to slow you down and murder you in the face. You can't change gear or talents or specs while it's running. You can't kick and replace people, otherwise the dungeon is forced to reset. And of course, you have to finish the whole thing to get loot. But at 16s and below, the timers are not going to have an effect on the gear that you earn at the end of a dungeon or with the Great Vault. Okay, so how about the real Mythic Plus? What about the 20s and so on and so forth? Now, in order to access Keystone levels 17 and higher, you do need to clear 16, but you also need to beat the time. That is what's going to get you that plus 17 key, or even higher if you clear it that much faster. And from here, Mythic Plus world is going to feel like it always has, from the gearing to the timing to, pushing keys, decay, and all the social nuance that comes from wanting that ideal group to not just clear, but to beat that time. The one difference that comes to mind are, again, crest fragments. Now, this might feel like a nerf or even a buff, but just like in the non-competitive bracket, 16s and lower, completing a key, timed or not, are going to get you 8 of these fragments. We could always debate around that number. I'm totally open for that, but I'd like to think that this isn't going to be a huge deal because aspects will eventually become so plentiful, you're going to want to trade it to your alt, and that's an entirely different conversation. What we have here are 2 disruptive ideas that focus on carving out a bigger space for less competitive and more, casual dungeon challenges, but we're taking different approaches here. The Super Dungeon idea is tuned to feel like a Mega Dungeon, awarding hero class gear and a handful of aspects while keeping the current Mythic Plus model as it is. The Mythic Plus revamp changes the current game by shifting the functionality of the timer to what's considered the higher level keys and reframing what Mythic Plus is in this more casual, this not so competitive bracket. Now, of course, these are only ideas. These are just jumping off points with knobs that can be adjusted. Questions include things like, okay, does it have to be 16s where the timer no longer matters? Can it be like, 14s or even 12s where this timer penalty is lifted? Or perhaps should it be higher? Should there be additional loot limits because of the spammability? And of course, what about raiding? How is that going to feel relevant in the face of an even more accessible infinite farm? So of course my ideas are full of holes, and I invite you to call them out, but while some might take a concern and say, okay, yeah, this obviously is why it won't work, what I want to do is try to take these and turn them around and be like, okay, here's the concern, how can we make it work? The aim shared between these two ideas is to slowly change, with emphasis on the slow parts, but to slowly change the culture surrounding Mythic Plus by driving a clear separation between more casual players who just want to run tougher dungeons and the more competitive players who want to be the best and continuously push their limits. Season 2 of Dragonflight has already got us moving in that direction a little bit, with easier keys at lower levels, followed by this extra dungeon with extra lucrative drops, and it's not under the Mythic Plus umbrella, it's just difficult. The WoW team can use this example as a jumping off point to solidify the existence of this less competitive bracket of dungeon clearing. There are a number of common counter-arguments against having a Mythic Plus structure without timers, or at least without timers mattering. The most talked about one, without timers, I guess people are going to just sit on Bloodlust and other cooldowns to take on just one pack at a time. Dungeon runs are going to take hours to clear, and basically people will get easy gear with no real exercise of skill. A timer, some folks would say, is the cold and calculating skill check that would encourage these would-be lazies to get good. But what about the mega dungeon that we have right now? We're not exactly seeing widespread use of that sort of degenerate behavior. I doubt that inexperienced pugs have spent so many hours slamming their faces into one trash pack at a time. At worst, we see what we usually see in raids. People who are, progressing through the dungeon, the group breaks up for whatever reason, and fragments of them, they try to make their own groups and try to continue on. Someone in chat, actually they were a guildmate, they pointed out that one of my guild's mega dungeon runs, it took a total runtime of 6 hours to clear. Sorry, that's a long time. But also, that's a guild, and they chose to do it. They chose to never give up. I don't see any problem with players who know each other and have bonded together. I don't see any problem with them making that choice and persevering. The fact that they were guildmates was obviously the glue that kept that run going for as long as it did, I'm sure. But if a team is willing to do that, really, who are we to stop them? And also, since this practice only works up until 17s when the timer is back in play in order to advance to higher keys, it's hard to see a huge impact. Just because the timer doesn't hand out a penalty, it doesn't make clearing the dungeon any easier. It doesn't mean free gear because you still have to finish with your current group. So again, the hope is that taking actions like these will influence a culture shift in WoW's PvE content. Culture shifts don't happen overnight. There is going to be, no doubt, confusion and anger, as well as some hope and optimism. And this could easily not work or have unintended results that could make the early leavers, for example, feel even more emboldened to leave, meaning quick responses to actionable feedback is going to be necessary. But I can envision this, and it's thanks to the Mega Dungeon. I can see a World of Warcraft with tough PvE content that doesn't orbit around the goal of making time, that's oversensitive to the meta or the influence of top players. And I'd be grateful for your thoughts and feedback. And that's it. Like the video, subscribe, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.